Hey guys, what's up? It's Double Zug. So now that Firelands is out, I'm sure a lot of you have run the raid at least once, maybe some heroic bosses, some normal. If you're a healer, you've probably noticed that a lot of like the damage patterns and the healing profiles are actually like super different in Firelands than in Tier 11. Tier 11 has a lot of raid damage, a lot of like unavoidable damage, pretty high average like HPS requirements per boss, pretty high like average healer requirements on progression. Whereas Firelands, there's a lot of fights in Firelands where like most of the damage is on like one or two tanks, and there's really not that much raid healing. And if there is raid healing, the raid is going to be spread out a lot of the time. So things like Healing Rain, Holy Radiance, even sometimes Prayer of Healing are just like not going to be as effective at healing that raid damage as they would be otherwise. In this video, I'm just going to go over like a build for each healer that is going to be like much better at healing that kind of healing profile. A lot of my guides over the healers, I give you like the sort of generic raid healing build, and that's really good in the situations where like that healer is actually good. You know, in the HPAL guide, I said you should primarily be healing with LOD and Radiance, and all those things are true, but there's some context there, right? Some fights demand different things, and so I'm going to give you some talent builds that will give you a little bit of an edge on those fights specifically. So I'm going to start with Discipline. This is like the generic Discipline build, right? If you don't have to take inspiration. If you do have to take inspiration, it's going to look something like this. You know, Bale Rock, Shanox, Major Domo. Pretty much all the damage is like tank damage or like single target damage, right? So for those fights, you're going to want something that looks more like this generically. So this is for like maybe like a Shannock, something like that, where I would try to grab a point in Strength of Soul. If you're like really focused tank healing, this is going to do you well. It's going to, allow you to absolutely cap out your Rapture on the main tank and to just do a lot more like emergency spot healing on the tank with Power Word Shield. And then of course you always are going to want to have 3 in Empowered Healing for just like full tank healing fights. 5% on all your single target heals is really nice. And it's fine to drop like a point in Darkness to get these things. Also, Inspiration here, if you don't have to grab this, like if you have like a Resto Shaman and a Holy Priest, you can always like drop this for maybe an extra point in Darkness, and like any of these points are fine. You can get an extra in Soul Warding if you have a problem with the little CD on Power Word Shield. You could grab Desperate Prayer, or you could grab, Surge. You could grab a point in Short Fiend if you think that's going to be valuable. But again, like on these fights, especially during progression, like that extra 10% buff on your tanks in these fights where like 80% of the damage is on the tank, it's just really valuable to have. So this is going to be like a Shannox, like a generic, Major Domo tank healing build. For Bale Rock, specifically for Disc Priest, there's actually some interesting like tech you can do. That's a potentially good Short Fiend fight, just given that you're going to be spamming Flash Heal and using like all your mana in the beginning of the fight and sending your Fiend. But for that fight, I would do something like, I would probably run something like this. You're going to drop points in Mental Agility. This is a little bit of a mana reduction, but because of how Bale Rock works, you're not going to be casting that many of your instant cast spells on that fight. Pretty much just like Power Word Shield. And what we're going to be grabbing is full points in Strength of Soul. I wouldn't grab Train of Thought. I just don't think it's worth the points. But this is going to allow us to, like, once we get all of our stacks, we're going to be like spamming heal / greater heal into the tank. And this is going to make it so that we can cast like a huge amount of Power Word Shields. And that's just really, really nice to have that really big, juicy, like absorb buffer on the tank's HP on Bale Rock specifically. And then of course you can proc your Raptures on like other targets like the off tank or the whoever's soaking to get your mana back. But for this, it's just really, really nice to have extra uptime on Power Word Shield on the main tank. So this is like a Disc Bale Rock build. And again, the other build I showed you would be for like a Shannox or a Major Domo. So those are like the two main Discipline Priest variations that I would look at. You can also conceivably take a Glyph of Flash Heal or Glyph of Power Word Barrier over Glyph of Prayer of Healing on those like super focused single target healing fights. I'd probably err towards Barrier. Flash Heal is just like, it's not going to give you very much value at all. It's very unlikely that you're going to heal the tank below 25% health with the Flash Heal. Although this is like potentially good for your personal HPS, whereas Glyph of Power Word Barrier just makes your barrier, like if you're going to use it as a tank CD, it just makes it a little bit more powerful. So something to mention there. So for Resto Shaman, this is like a pretty typical, just all around standard build. Maybe some flex points here you could potentially put into like Nature's Blessing. So for Resto Shaman, for those like super focused single target tank healing type fights, I would probably run a build that looks something like this. There's a couple of things to mention here. This 1 point in Totemic Focus could go into Dispel if you needed to Dispel, but you don't really need to Dispel in any of those fights, right? So you can pretty safely drop this. So what we're grabbing here is we're going to grab Ancestral Awakening, which is like our crit bonus, and we're also going to grab Nature's Blessing, which is our like healing magnification on Earth Shield. Notably, we're still grabbing Telluric Currents, and we're dropping Blessing of the Eternals. Again, I just don't think this is like super great value even on tank healing, although that's just potentially incorrect. I just think like these other points that you can grab here are just going to be like consistently much more powerful. And then, you know, we get our hit talents, we get our Ellie weapons for just some passive healing here. I don't think your improved Earth Shield is going to be worth it. Earth Shield, just the most of the value of Earth Shield is just going to be from its like mana efficiency and also giving you your Nature's Blessing on the tank. The actual healing it does is like not super significant, although you could grab this if you do prefer it over something else. Again, this Totemic Focus point here is just, you know, give us a little bit of value of our Manatide Totem on these prog fights, especially Bale Rock. Value that you get from your Manatide on like 5 or 6 healers is just a lot. So this point in Totemic Focus is quite nice. You could also just like drop a point in something else to grab that if you want as well. You also could potentially consider dropping Bale Rock and Domo on those fights where you're literally never ever going to cast Healing Rain. You could potentially drop Focused Insight for Blessing of the Eternals, something like this. So yeah, for Resto Shaman, again, just consider having a build that has 3 in Nature's Blessing and 3 in Ancestral Awakening for those fights where you're going to be like doing a lot of just spamming like Greater Healing Wave into tanks. And, you know, most of your healing is not going to be coming from Healing Rain and Focused Insight. You could even potentially drop like Focused Insight here. For glyphs, there's not really anything you'd change other than just grabbing like Glyph of Earth Shield, Glyph of Water Shield for those tank healing fights. Also, on those tank healing fights, you're going to get a decently higher value from crit, given that you're going to be running 3 out of 3 in Ancestral Awakening. You can split some of your healing, right? Whenever you crit, you're going to cleave a little bit onto the other tank, which gives you a nice little bit of like extra smart healing, as well as just the ability to passively top players that are around the tank with those crit splashes, which is just quite nice. So crit is going to be a little bit more valuable here, but again, you're not really probably going to be changing too much of your gear around for those fights specifically. So for Resto Druid, your typical just like generic build is going to look something like this, with like maybe a point in Dispel swap to Nature's Bounty. But there's some interesting stuff we can do here, especially for like Bale Rock specifically, that we can do with Living Seed. So this is a talent that you don't take in the standard build just because, again, you're not really casting that many of the spells that this affects. Regrowth, Nourish, Healing Touch, those aren't like most of your healing. Most of your healing is from your periodic effects, which these other talents that we grab scale. For Bale Rock, and even potentially for like Shannox, fights like that where, again, you know, Alice Razor, where most of the damage is just like on 2 tanks. We could potentially do a build where we maximize the Living Seed value. So I'll show you what that looks like here. So what we're going to grab here is we're going to drop some of our like Genesis, Blessing of the Grove, these talents that scale our periodic effects and our rejuvenation. And in exchange, we're going to grab 3 Living Seed. This is when you critically hit target with like any of your single target casted heals, like Swift Mend, Regrowth, Nourish, Healing Touch. You get a Living Seed on the target for 30% of the amount healed. And then the next time they get hit, it will bloom and heal them. So this is like really strong for tank healing, especially if you're going to be spamming these casted heals into a tank. You know, this builds up over time. It's sort of like overheal protection, and then as soon as the tank gets hit, it procs like a Prayer of Mending. And this synergizes really well with Nature's Bounty, which is 60% crit chance on regrowth. So our regrowths are going to be proccing this Living Seed like very consistently, because they're going to have, you know, like 80% plus crit chance just with like raid buffs and sort of a normal secondary stat build for Resto Druid. So we're going to be dropping, again, like you don't really need Nature's Cure for any of the bosses here. I still keep Swift Rejuve just because like on some of these fights, it's just nice to have extra GCD time off, like rolling Rejuve on both tanks and potentially doing some rejuice to spot heal here and there on the raid. And then we're going to drop like Genesis over here, and we're going to get Moonglow for mana cost reduction. For this build, if you have any crit pieces to swap into, critical is just going to become way more valuable than Mastery and Haste for this type of Living Seed build for Druid. You really just want to be maximizing your crit chance to get more Living Seeds out there, as well as just like increase your mana sustain, because you're going to be spamming a lot of regrowth, which is, you know, decently expensive, especially on a fight like Bale Rock. This is a pretty interesting Resto Druid build. You can see like on the logs for Bale Rock, a lot of the top druids are using this. It's super effective, right? They're doing like the same HPS as Holy Paladins with this build, which is pretty impressive. The glyphs are pretty much the same, right? You just want Swiftman, Lifebloom, Rejuve. So for Holy Paladin, a traditional, just like all-around raid healing build is going to look like this, where you don't grab Last Word and Eternal Glory, and instead you opt for either Eye for an Eye or Improved Judgment in order to unlock Pursuit of Justice, which is just like a nice little movement speed boost, and also gives you this effect of like giving you some holy power when you get struck by like a CC. Firelands, for basically almost every fight in Firelands, actually, I would actually choose to run a WoG-focused build where you do something like this, where you get 3 points in Tower of Radiance. For your tank healing, it just makes it infinitely less punishing to cast a heal into your beacon target. It actually makes casting heals into your beacon target decently efficient and like not a terrible choice at all, as well as just giving you like some extra crit chance on your WoG when you heal a target below 35%. 35% isn't too low of a threshold, so you might get some value in a fight out of this. And Eternal Glory, which is a 30% chance for WoG not to consume holy power. So this is effectively just a 30% increase to WoG's healing overall, assuming that you aren't global limited, right? So this is nice. It's not like super consistent or predictable, but when it does happen, it's quite nice. So yeah, I would run this build for basically every fight in Firelands. I would run this build. There's really not too much value because, again, a lot of these fights, even the fights where there is some raid healing to be done, a lot of the time the raid is going to be spread out outside of Holy Radiance distance. So you're going to be doing a lot more like spot healing with Divine Light than you are going to be doing Holy Radiance spamming. And in those situations, just like having these WoG points are a little bit nice, just to do some emergency spot healing, especially because a lot of these fights, your LOD is going to be harder to find effective targets for. Whenever you can find effective targets for LOD, it's just way better than WoG on average, and does like more tank healing through the beacon as well. Some of these fights you just can't find LOD targets, so you're going to have to use WoG, and in that case, it's just really, really nice to have these additional talents here that just make WoG less worse than LOD. So yeah, that's the Holy Paladin build. One thing to mention for the Holy Paladin build is that potentially on some of these fights, you're going to want to swap out Divine Favor or Holy Shock for Glyph of Word of Glory. I believe if you look at like the logs, like this is the rank 1 Balerock healing parse. Word of Glory is 20% of their overall healing, and Holy Shock is only like 8.2%. If you look at this, like just mathematically, the Glyph of WoG is going to be better than Glyph of Holy Shock. I probably wouldn't drop Divine Favor just because it's really nice to have like a CD in an emergency situation where, maybe one of your healers gets Torment or something like that, or just something happens. Usually like having the burst HPS that this affords you is going to be really, really like just qualitatively useful. But like if you look at this situation, like Word of Glory Glyph is just going to be more throughput than Holy Shock Glyph. The only problem here is that 5% less crit on Holy Shock is going to be like, 20% less infusion procs, which is like, it's sort of hard to quantify how much value that is, but it's a decent amount of value. But just keep it in mind that potentially on like Balerock, maybe even Majordomo, or like Shannox, you might want to swap Glyph of WoG in for Holy Shock, or even potentially Divine Favor. I would never swap off Seal of Insight. It's just insane. So yeah, that's the Holy Paladin build here. One other thing to mention with Holy Paladin is that Mastery is going to increase in value a lot relative to like Haste and Crit. Crit is actually better for tank healing than Mastery, in my opinion, if you have targets for your Light of Dawn. Because Light of Dawn has a high number of instances of healing, and all of them transfer through Beacon, all those instances can crit, and when they crit, that healing that you get extra from crit is also transferred through Beacon, dramatically increases your like passive tank healing. Whereas with Mastery, all the healing that's additional on your LOD with Mastery is not transferred into the tank. So personally, I just find that critical is just better if you're going to be doing a lot of LODing. But in Firelands, we're going to be doing a lot more WoG casting. And if you're casting a WoG into a tank, especially if you're casting your WoG into your beacon target, you don't really get too much value from crit there. You're really going to want to be maximizing your Mastery because a lot of the time you're going to be wogging into a tank that's like nearly full. A lot of it's going to be overhealing, and most of the value you get from it is going to be that Mastery shield. So something to keep in mind there, especially on fights like Domo and Balerock, where you're going to be overhealing a huge amount anyways, and so you just want to maximize the amount of Absorb shield you apply to the tank with all your casts. All right, so last we're going to talk about Holy Priest. So I just released a guide for Holy Priest, and in that guide, I just discussed how like you really don't have that much flexibility in your spec on Holy Priest, and that's basically true, right? So we're not really going to be like transforming our build too much on Holy Priest, honestly, for these like tank healing fights. We're just obviously going to be swapping into single target chakra a lot more and using more of our cast heals than like the Renew focused playstyle. But there's a couple of things we can do here. So one thing that I would recommend is I would drop points in Body and Soul for points in Divine Fury. We're going to be casting a lot more like heal, greater heal. This is just a little bit more value. And like most of those fights where you're just tank healing, you don't really need this sprint for anything. Other than that, there's really not too much to say. The one thing to mention is with your glyphs, I would glyph Guardian Spirit and swap out Prayer of Healing for Flash Heal. Potentially, if you can get your Lightwell into a spot where like your tanks are actually clicking it. Although like, you know, the value on tanks of Lightwell is like pretty small, so I probably would just run Glyph of Flash Heal over POH on those fights again where you're like basically never going to cast POH ever. This is just going to give you a tiny bit more value. And obviously GS is a nice tank external. So a little bit of a less cooldown is quite nice. But really like the only thing you can do here is just swap some points into Divine Fury out of Body and Soul. And that's like your entire tank healing build as Holy. So yeah, not too much of a change there. The only other thing to mention is you could potentially take points out of Darkness and put them into Short Fiend. Your Renew Breakpoint is going to become a little bit less significant while you're tank healing because most of your healing isn't going to be Renew, it's going to be your casted heals. But I don't know if this is like super valuable. Again, you could also just swap on like one extra piece of haste gear to make your Breakpoint in exchange for Veiled Shadows. As long as you aren't dropping Spirit to get that extra haste on your gear, probably worth for like those super long fights like maybe Domo, or even to get a second Fiend in Bale Rock, this could be decent. So something to mention there for Holy Priest. So those are the 5 builds to mention. Again, Firelands, you're going to have to change your healing philosophy quite a bit from tier 12 to like heal efficiently. You're going to have to unlearn a lot of habits that you learned in tier 12 where again, so many of the fights in tier 11 have unavoidable damage. They have pretty high raid damage. You're focusing a lot on like being really a mana efficient, doing like consistent HPS into the raid. Whereas in Firelands, you're a lot more focused on like spot healing and tank healing. So, you have to change your talents to reflect those requirements. So those are the builds. Hopefully you learned something from this. Hopefully it helps you in your progression if you're a healer. If you did learn something, if you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, send a comment below if you have any questions. I also do have a Discord where you can go to like ask any more specific questions if you want to. That's just in the description. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu. Zug Zug.